welcome everyone. I'll just do a bit of an introduction whilst a few more people are joining the webinar. So for those of you who haven't met me before, I see some familiar faces and some new faces in the audience. My name is Tim Foster. I'm a senior lecturer in water and food security here at the University of Manchester, and working on the agriculture and rural livelihood stream of the Future Dams project. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome our seminar speaker, Professor Bill Adams, who is the Moran Professor of Conservation and Development, Department of Geography at the University of Cambridge. Bill his research is focused on areas around conservation and sustainable development. He also has a long sort of history of working on water resources management and issues around development and river basin planning, including being sort of part of and involved in the World Commission on Dams several years back now. So Bill is going to be giving the seminar today, which is titled Perfecting the River, Dams, Streams and Organic Machines. This is our final Future Dams seminar of 2021. We will be having a few more seminars and webinars in the new year, which will be circulating more details about in the coming weeks. In terms of the format of today's events, we have about an hour and a half, so about 4:30 UK time. So Bill will talk for 45 minutes or so. I will then sort of offer a bit of reflections on the talk and invite in particular some of our case study partners on the Future Dams project to contribute to that. And then we should have around half an hour or so at the end for open Q&A from the remainder and the wider audience of the seminar. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. So if you could please obviously keep yourself on mute during the seminar. If you have questions as we go through the seminar, please feel free to post those in the chat box, and we can either come back to them at the end, or we can, if you're still here, we can invite you to ask your question verbally once we move into that Q&A session towards the end. Other than that, I think I will pass over to Bill to start his presentation. Thank you, Bill.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. Just to get my screen share up. There we are. Right. So it's very nice to be invited to come and talk. I had the privilege actually of giving a lecture as the project began in 2017, and putting this one together, it feels as a bit rather as if I'm challenging myself to talk about what I've learned as being through being involved with the project. So the title I've chosen is an odd one, and I hope it'll become clear at the end. To start where I mean to end up, the phrase "the organic machine" is one that comes from an amazing book by a historical geographer called Richard White, "The Organic Machine, the Remaking of the Columbia River." And it was published in 1995, and he talked about the interplay between human history and natural history in the Columbia River in North America. He talked about the impact of dams and other development on salmon. He talked about its effect on treaties and so on. He told us sort of a supernatural history. And he chose this metaphor in the title of the book for the river, which he said is an organic machine, an energy system, which although by human interventions retains its natural, its unmade qualities. And I was reading this again the other day and reflecting that it is a challenge really to think about dams and think about the rivers that they transform in a very wide context. And Scarpino, in a review of the book, talks about the nature of the river that he describes. He says it's a cyborg-like cultural artifact, a blend of the human and the natural, that not only serves and obeys, but also confounds and frustrates those who must address the consequences of the process of transformation. And it seems to me that's the challenge that faces all those involved in future dams, all those involved in dam construction or opposing dam construction, all those involved in river management, is how to think about this huge organic machine of the river. What sort of ways should we understand it? And that's a little bit about what I want to talk about today. Those of you who know me know that I bring a lot of baggage to this whole topic. In my own PhD was done on the impacts of a dam in the northwest of Nigeria, the Bakalori Dam. That's it at the top when it was being built in about 1980. That's it, the irrigation scheme that it fails to serve off Google Maps in 2012. So I spent 2 or 3 years involved in that, and then went on, to, where am I? There. Then went on to work for an engineering company on another project, also in Nigeria, the Dalinkawa project on the Benue River. That's the dam that wasn't built when I was there, because I was working on the resettlement project, and that's the lake in 2018. It's a terrific place for a dam, and it's a terrible place for a lake. It flooded huge amounts of very productive floodplain land. And I guess I've spent a lot of the time in between, both in the last decades of the last century, when I worked full time on water resources, and subsequently thinking about how it is that dam projects too often work like this. They don't achieve the aims that are predicted for them. They certainly don't meet the hopes that are expected for them. And how we should think about the process of development that we create. And I've written about this several times, both in my own work on dams, but also more recently in my involvement with Chris Schultz in a sub-project of the Future Dams project on the World Commission on Dams, their report, Dams and Development in 2000, which I had a remote role in writing. And we've looked back, Chris's research, interviewing all of the people involved in it, including a number that have spoken or are part of the project. Jamie Skinner, for example, Achim Steiner, who was the secretary of the entire process. And therefore, I'm thinking both back to my own experiences of dams, but also my experiences in that process and studying that process and trying to understand really how to do dams better, and where are the tricks, where are the problems in the process. So I'll split it up into 4 sections. I'll talk a little bit about dams, a bit about what I call dreams, the ways in which we think about dams, and say something about organic machines and how we move on beyond what I'm calling the idea of the perfect river. Okay, so let's think about dams. We are in, I think, a period of increasing pressure to develop and control rivers. This is from the famous paper a few years ago, Dams Under Construction, Dams Planned. This is a century of renewed interest in dams as particularly a source of hydropower, as contributing to national grids, contributing to attempts to decarbonize energy production. So it's a critical period for the work of future dams, critical period for anyone who's interested in dams, whether they're warm and favorable towards them or whether they're skeptical of them. And you can see that this pressure to build dams is very strongly focused in the global periphery. And therefore there are new environments there where people are coming to terms with what dams do, both for good and for bad, for the first time. It comes on top of, a century of dam construction. You can think of the 20th century, I suppose, as the age of dams, an age of dams, and the period of the 20th century, particularly the second half of the 20th century, saw dams being constructed first in the industrialized world and then in the developing world in many, many rivers. And by the late 80s, there were 40,000 or so dams over 15 meters high. So, you know, we're in a period of intense investment in dams. We've also come through a century, or more truly, perhaps a 2/3 of a century of dam construction. We ought to be pretty good at it by now. And the effects of it have been quite extensive. I mean, this is a paper that was published by Krista Nielsen and others back in 2005, but it's basically their attempt to map the fragmentation and flow regulation of the world's biggest river systems. And you can see that, and it would be even more extensive since then. A majority of river systems are starting to be impacted, and many of those that were not impacted then are down to be planned. So we're turning, if you like, a set of a world of natural rivers into a world of harnessed rivers. And it's happening really quite extensively. The extent of it's probably only now dawning on ecologists. This is a recent paper, for example, on fragmentation of European rivers. And this is an attempt to map all the barriers in European rivers. And there are many more than had previously been known about. The two diagrams on the right show barrier density that are sort of published on the top, and then estimated barrier density from field observations below. So we have already done a great deal, I suppose, to turn wild flowing organic machines into harnessed and controlled organic machines, to use Richard White's frame. And the question I think that's interesting about that is that it raises for us the challenge of asking whether, on balance, the effects of those processes were fully predicted, whether they have happened as predicted, and whether, on balance, the trade between the way in which the machine used to work and the way in which it works now is a good one. Dear, oh dear. Sorry, this some reason my computer is not working the way I want it to work. Where have I gone? Oh dear. Where are we? Okay, so we're in this period of, we have been and we are in a period of intense dam construction. We're also in a period of intense conflict over dams. And this is from the Environmental Justice Atlas that's run out of the University of Barcelona. It just picks up water-based conflicts, not all of which are dams, but many of which have dams as part of the program. I mean, it's a fascinating and sort of interactive project, but it's simply a reminder to say that the construction of dams is happening in many different jurisdictions. It's also opposed in many jurisdictions. It's problematic. We have known about these impacts for a long time. The World Commission on Dams was created started in 1998, reported in 2000. It made a set of key recommendations, and its purpose was a sort of once for all fix to dams. And the argument, the rhetoric at the time was that we've had a century of dam construction. We have perhaps let our technical skills exceed our understanding of impacts. How do we do dams that work from the point of view of all participants? And they had a whole series of recommendations, which you're probably more than familiar with now. Chris Schultz has given a seminar right to this group, and if you want more, contact him or read some of our papers. But basically, it made the argument that dams ought to be constructed and developed in such a way that they avoided and reduced negative social and environmental impacts wherever possible. It should, that ought to be the starting position for planning. Secondly, that one needs to assess development needs and alternatives early. And they said, if you like, they said, set the challenges. What is the problem to which a dam is deemed to be the solution? And you need to think about first what you're trying to achieve in development before coming up with the dam as a solution. And they had a whole commitment to the rights and risks approach, which Achim Steiner referred to a few weeks ago. And they proposed that dam construction should be constrained by the principles of free, prior, and informed consent for indigenous peoples. And above all, they said, dams need to be managed, built and managed in such a way that you turn losers into beneficiaries. So the thing we like about the World Commission, it's been very interesting going back, having been involved in some way at the time, to go back and see how it worked, how it came together with its recommendations. It certainly was its aspiration to make a permanent shift in the way dams were planned and managed. Did it solve the problem? Well, no, it didn't. There were a number of difficulties that commentators have picked out. The first was that a number of governments didn't accept its findings. As Biswas commented in 2012 in his book, that all developing country governments unanimously agreed that it was biased and couldn't be accepted. Well, that's probably not true, but a number did step back from accepting its proposals. Donors were also, in the event, skeptical about it. They said critics said it was too negative, too anti-growth, too impractical, too slow, too complex, too bureaucratic. And essentially, if you think about it, the challenge was too big a challenge to the World Dams community. And I put the name of Marshall Murphy up there. He's a friend who's recently passed away. He was a Zimbabwean expert on community-based natural resource management. And he often used to say of community-based management that it wasn't tried and found wanting, but found difficult and not tried. He said people in conservation talk about giving power to the community, but they never actually do it because it looks too difficult. I might say he took his quote originally made by G.K. Chesterton about Christianity. So perhaps in a sense, it wasn't that the World Commission on Dams' recommendations were tried and found not to work. It was simply they were looked at and it was, well, that looks awkward. That'll be difficult. That means we can't build as many dams. We can't build the dams we've already got on the list. And so it wasn't tried. What did happen, of course, was there have been extensive efforts to pick bits from that agenda, to add other bits onto it, particularly from the International Hydropower Association with its sustainability standard and its hydropower sustainability certification scheme, and huge efforts by many parties to, if you like, do the job of the Commission again, or rethink the Commission's report in ways that were more usable, user-friendly, more palatable. So it's not that people just tore the World Commission's report up and forgot about it. If you like, it has survived in various sorts of forms, and it has actually been tried in various contexts, for example, by the German government. But there was such a gap between the kind of ways that we might have wished dams to operate and the way they actually operate in the dam construction business, that the Commission's recommendations were not able to bridge that gap for the wider dams community. And that, of course, is where Future Dams comes in as a project. The effort, the contribution to the wider challenge of making dams that are in every sense sustainable, developing a number of sort of structured ways of thinking. That's the piece where we came in. Meanwhile, where are we on dams? Well, it's a very interesting to reflect. One person who can do so with a lot of benefits of hindsight is Ted Scudder. Thea Scudder, he is an anthropologist. He's been working since the late 1950s on dams and on the impacts of dams, particularly in Zambezi around Kariba. I saw Jack Leslie is on the call. Hi. Your book, Deep Water, a terrific set of interviews with key people from the World Commission. And you entitled your chapter on TED, the search for one good dam. And Ted himself talks about this and about whether or not it's possible to push and wrangle dam projects into a form where you don't end up with a litany of problems. And he remained hopeful long after the World Commission's report. He was a commissioner, of course. He's now of considerable age. He has become quite cynical about the process. His last book, 2018, Large Dams, Long-Term Impacts on Riverine Communities and Free-Flowing Rivers, was for me a sad read because he is, well, in as much as he starts to sound bitter, I think, about his own ability, his own contribution to improving the way dams were written. He said in a recent, a couple of years ago, blog on the Caltech website. He spent his whole of his latter part of his career in Caltech as an anthropologist in an engineering department, which must be a fascinating context to do the kind of work that he does or did. By the mid-1970s, he said, I realized all the wonderful things people said could be done with dams weren't happening. The people displaced by these dams are often ethnic minorities with their own religious and social systems. These were people who were very poor to begin with, but they were self-sufficient. It turned out the governments weren't really that interested in the welfare of the very poor rural people displaced by the dams. And he basically criticizes himself and everybody else in the dams world for failing to develop projects which don't have adverse impacts on these people. So why are we in this situation? Why are we in the situation where we know so much about how dams work? We know so much of where they go wrong, and yet we've had such sort of collation of information, such synthesis as the World Commission and indeed the contemporary hydropower sustainability work. Why is there this persistent gap? Why, if one looks now, is it so easy to find dams that are just as disappointing, just as destructive, just as unpopular as those that preceded them? It's as if, as people working in the dam community, we don't learn anything. So one of the reasons I think I've put down under the notion of dreams, that dams are not doing what you think they're doing. Dams have a life of their own. They have a power of their own, which is quite separate from or quite additional to, on a different level to the assessment of their benefits and their impacts. And to give you an example, let me talk to you about the Volta. So dams have a life of their own, partly because once a good dam site has been identified, it never quite goes away. It's never dropped. So the Volta dam on the Volta was originally proposed back in 1920. Sir Albert Kitson, who was director of the Gold Coast Geological Survey, was canoeing down the river. He came to the waterfalls in what's now Akasombo, and he said this would be a cool place for a dam. You could build a dam here quite easily, and you could use the power, you could generate power, and you could use power to process Ghanaian bauxite. Bauxite's the raw material of making aluminium. So you could create an aluminium industry in the middle of Ghana, in the middle of West Africa, 1920s. The idea was kicked around then in colonial territory that became Ghana through the 20s, through the 30s, through the 40s, and finally, quite late in the colonial era in Ghana, a feasibility study was begun in the 1950s and what became the Volta River project. Hugely ambitious, a dam to generate hydropower and an aluminium industry to dig up the bauxite, use the hydropower to process it, and then export it. And when Kwame Nkrumah was released from jail in 1951 and allowed to join the political process that led to independence, he grabbed hold of this project and he said, this is what we'll do. It promised an industrial future for an independent Ghana. It promised a shift from what we now think of as a developing country to an industrialized country, a sort of one-shot change of status. So in 1956, the Preparatory Commission finally produced its report. And it's interesting, they did take 6 years to produce their report. This was not some quick piece of consultancy. It was amazingly thorough. And it came at a time when aluminium prices were at an all-time low. And so nothing happened. Jump on 5 or 6 years, and the Volta Dam pops back onto the agenda. Why? Well, partly because aluminium prices have picked up a bit, mostly because the USA wanted to fund a major dam project because the USSR had just agreed to fund the Aswan Dam in Egypt. So it was all about the geopolitics of funding. The money became available. The project was shorn of many of its most expensive bits. It was designed and built by Kaiser Engineering. The smelter was built by Kaiser Aluminium, another American company. They were going to use bauxite brought in from their mine in Jamaica. This was not going to use Ghanaian bauxite. And off it went. 1965, Volta Dam, Akosombo Dam completed. The Volta Lake fills, the largest human-made lake in the world, over 8,000 kilometers. It displaced 80,000 people. It had ongoing downstream impacts. It generated 900 megawatts of power. It's the dam that we're familiar with today. My point is simply that this is not a simple process. This is not someone saying what is the optimal strategy for Ghana, what is the optimal economic response. This is a process of approving this project, which is messy and multivalent and remarkably political. And in the Ghanaian context, a number of people writing about it, particularly put up here, Misha's papers on Nkrumah and Akosombo, talk about the way in which the idea of the dam, the very size of it, the very dramatic changes it would make in the country and in the floodplain of the Volta. I mean, the unbelievable size of the thing. That was partly a buying into an idea of modernity. It wasn't just a project, it was a symbol of some future. And a number of people have written about the way in which dams, almost uniquely among other projects, are thought of in terms of the future they can deliver. The top quote here, in the context of dams in South Asia, they promise an ideal river that's predictable, useful, and completely in the service of humanity. They offer a way of turning a huge natural machine into a harnessed machine, making, if you like, a human natural machine out of something which otherwise simply produces, fish and the odd field full of rice. And the quote at the bottom from Kaika's paper on the Marathon Dam in Athens talked about the way in which the creation of the dam in the 1920s spoke not just about the benefits that it would bring in terms of water supply for Athens, which was much needed, but also about, it embodied these sort of social and cultural ideas and dreams and imaginations. So when you think about the way in which dam projects come to be, you not only have the question about the changes to the hydrology, the ecology of the reservoir, the requirement to resettle people, the benefits from the power generation or the water supply or the irrigation. You also have this sort of whole ideological level, that they're a symbol of something. They're a symbol of transformation, of control. They're a symbol of human futures, of modernization. And therefore, the dam's decisions are made in practice. They also have this dreamlike level. And a number of people have commented on this. Timothy Mitchell does in his book, Rule of Experts, on technopolitics and modernity in Egypt. And he talks a little bit about the history of developments in that basin, the early Cairo barrages in the 19th century, the early Aswan Dam in 1902, the Aswan High Dam in the 1950s, and you might add to that perhaps the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, GERD, which has been built in the last few years in Ethiopia. All of these projects have a material justification. All of them are designed to contribute something to the economy, be it irrigation water in the case of the Egyptian dams or hydro power in the case of GERD. But they also serve a purpose, which is a wider purpose. They serve a purpose at the level of dreams. And those are really very significant. And this is not something that's a feature only of developing countries. It's absolutely true of rivers in the developed world. You can see it particularly strongly in the United States, back in the Columbia Basin, for example, which Richard White was talking about. You can see the construction of larger and larger dams within that system, particularly the Grand Coulee Dam, built in the 1930s, built during the 1930s, during the period of the Great Depression, delivering employment delivering power, delivering benefits in terms of navigation and other things, and causing all kinds of difficulties, particularly blocking the passage of salmon up and down the river. In describing the Grand Coulee Dam, I mean, it attracted the power, the cheap, freely available power attracted World War II industries. It enabled the economy and population of the Pacific Northwest of the US to grow rapidly post-war. So they built it and the economy responded, but it was built in a sense at the level or rather part of its significance was not just the material, it was also the conceptual, the ethereal, if you like. And I've spoken about this before, but I mean, you can see it in the Columbia. If you want to get on Spotify, you can listen to the otherwise radical folk singer Woody Guthrie, who in 1941 recorded a set of 6 songs about the Columbia River for the Bonneville Power Administration, the Federal Power Administration. And it was propaganda. It was done during the war, but it was done also to promote the federal provision of power as a means to develop the Northwest of the country. And this is part of his lyrics for his song "Roll On, Columbia, Roll On." He said, "Uncle Sam took up the challenge in the year of '33 for the farmer and the factory and all of you and me. He said, 'Roll on, Columbia, you can ramble to the sea, but river, while you're rambling, you can do some work for me.'" And he goes on and then describes Washington and Oregon, the factories humming, making chromium and magnesium and aluminium. And he links that to the war effort. And there roars the flying fortress now to fight for Uncle Sam, spawned upon the King Columbia by the big Grand Coulee Dam. So here he is talking about the symbolic significance of the dam. So you can look at this and say, well, obviously, you need to think about this in terms of the ecology of its impacts, the distribution of those impacts between, let's say, Indian groups who lost their salmon fishery versus, the people who moved into the area and were able to have lives in the new industry. Or you can think about it economically. What did it cost to do? What was the economic benefit? But flying above that, like the flying fortresses above the ravaged cities of Europe, you have this ideal, this dream of development, which Woody Guthrie captures in his song. And what it's doing is tapping into a very long and well-established idea about improvement. This goes back into the great European imperial era, the great and terrible European era. The book Nature's Government talks about this, the doctrine of improvement of agriculture, reclaiming wastelands and making, as Europeans then thought about it, barbarous people civilized. The focusing of science and planning on the transformation of, for example, the West Indies through those plantations, through the slaves who were brought in and locked into these systems of production. And a number of people have commented that in the 20th century, the process of development, while more benign, is essentially similar. It's an organized and coherent attempt to use rational means to drive forward improvements in the average human condition, right through to the Millennium Development Goals in 2005, not 2015, and the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. So, we have this history of harnessing, of rationalizing and ordering, which dams fit into very well. And there's a critique of that. Of course, you'd expect me to say that. Herbert Frankel, writing in Baldwin's book on the Niger Agricultural Project, this was a colonial project in middle of Nigeria to grow oil seeds, to grow groundnuts, peanuts, to provide edible oil for Europe in the period of just after the Second World War. Rationing didn't finish in Britain, for example, until 1952, and we were critically short of edible oils. And the project failed completely for reasons I don't need to go into here. It had nothing to do with dams. It was a dryland project, but it didn't work. And in writing about it, Herbert Frankel, the famous economist, in the introduction to Baldwin's book, talks about the twin dangers in all development of grandiosity and arrogance. And dams really, fit that. They are grand and they're arrogant and bold, and there is a danger in that. And I've also put Marston Bates at the bottom there. He's much forgotten, probably quite rightly these days, but his book Where Winter Never Comes, which is also a critique of tropical development, he rather nicely says back in 1953, "I'm bothered always by the Western arrogance, by its assurance that it knows all of the answers and can quite readily fix everything, so the tropical peoples can live happily ever after, if only they will listen." So that's the problem with dams. And Philip Seddon's book, Concrete Revolution, on the US Bureau of Reclamation, does an excellent job in identifying what dams were expected to do as disseminated by US aid through the work of the US Bureau of Reclamation in the post-war period. They were expected to revolutionize economies and societies through power and irrigation development, and they were expected to consolidate geopolitical alliances through technological expertise. So they're working not just downwards into the landscape, not just outwards into the economy, but upwards into the world of politics. And he says, for most of the 20th century, the socio-political changes wrought by large dams were afterthoughts to their geopolitical and developmental utility. And I would actually, yes, I think actually sometimes the economic benefits were afterthoughts to their geopolitical benefits. Cost-benefit analysis and other processes have always been, as Whittington and Smith, Dale Whittington, who I think is also on the call, writes, ex-ante cost-benefit analysis are always deeply embedded in the political process. And that's something the World Commission on Dams made little mention of, this dams of dreams, the power of those dreams. And Scudder, poor Scudder, writing his latest paper I've seen of his on Laos's Nam Chun 2 dam, says the construction of dams is seldom, if ever, based on detailed processes of options assessment. And where mega dams are involved, this stage of options assessment is bypassed because the decision has been made by the head of state or a country's political elite. So what do dams do? Dams do something which has nothing to do with what they do. What they do is block the river, hold back the water, generate power, provide irrigation systems. But actually what they're really doing is meeting these other processes, or at least what they're also doing is meeting those other processes. So back to the organic machine, Richard White's organic machine, neither organic or mechanical, but both. The river is imagined as a machine to deliver human benefits via the construction of dams, flood control, irrigation, etc. And in the post-war period, water was seen as one of the most important natural resources that could be converted in this way by hydraulic works and structures. And hydrology, the science, rose to enable that process. So the river is turned into a machine. It's turned into a machine by human investment in systems of engineering and control. And there are certain sorts of technologies, both technologies as in the dams themselves, but also technologies as in ideas that delivered that. And the most powerful probably was the river basin, the idea of river basin planning. Again, this grew out of the US in the 1930s. The Tennessee Valley Authority, founded in 1933, as a mechanism for doing everything from flood control through soil conservation, through to industrial development and national defense. The TVA is still going, although mostly a power generating agency these days. And the model was exported internationally via the United Nations, most famously to the Mekong. Snedden and Bin, in writing about the Mekong Committee's work in 1957, an almost evangelical faith in science and technical progress. So these were the technologies that generated the river as a managed machine. And the idea that the river could be understood and treated as a machine was predicated on the possibility of being able to predict and control its behavior. Predict it and control it through engineering structures, through formally stated technical plans, and by connected programs to deliver it. So managing a river as a machine demanded that it was imagined as a machine. And White's also talks about this. He talks about the way in which the Columbia River began to relate in the second half of the 20th century to what he calls the virtual river. A virtual river flowing across computer screens. With scientific modeling, the river can now be a virtual river, only so many coded lines of computer language on a screen. And so he talks, if you like, about the creation of an idea of the river, a virtual river, which could be run away from the physical river. And it was the trick was to use the quantifying techniques of hydrology. Hydrology advanced very fast through the 20th century. Statistical frequency analysis coming in 1914, for example, an international association in the 1930s, and then critically in the 1960s, computers and the power to create quantitative models. So by the end of Richard White's period, you have a real Columbia River flowing up and down its bed, flowing its waters flowing into the back of reservoirs, its waters supporting salmon trying to move up and down stream and dealing with pollution, et cetera, et cetera. That's the physical river. But you also had a river of planning, a virtual river, a perfectible river. And this is important because I think increasingly now we see real rivers through the lens of the virtual river. We understand the real river through the models we make of the virtual river. And a big part of the Future Dams project has been about modeling, and a number of you on the call, this is what you do, this is the life that you lead. So what I'm saying here is going to be absolutely obvious to you. It's my attempts to, I think, to understand the way in which modeling is useful in imagining the river. The critical thing I think we need to understand with this virtual river is that model outputs are agents. Model outputs change debates about what might be done, what should be done, and what will happen if it is done. Modeling is never, or very rarely, neutral. And the moment you create a model and you use its outputs in planning, it actually changes the nature of that debate. That's the first thing to understand. The second is that models simplify, but they're often treated as holistic. Models that you can only model what you can measure or estimate. Models test assumptions, but they're used to predict futures. They promote what I call projectization, the creation of organized processes and structures of investment, and they enable and promote trade-offs. So you can create a virtual river where you can make hard decisions, and then you can do those in the real river. And therefore, there's a politics to this process. Virtual river politics means that models empower those who model because they're listened to, those who employ modelers and set the questions they ask, those with data or who decide which data is included, and those who have wealth, education, and connections in government. So modeling is part of a power game. It's part of the idea of the perfect river in the machine is something that affects the real river on the outside. And all of this planning is outside, away from riverine communities. So what can we do? How do we move beyond the creation of models that are unhelpful in the kinds of impacts they have? How do we move beyond what I'm calling then the perfect river? Treating the real river as if it were a machine is problematic because real rivers are much more complicated than the perfect river of the imagination. We need to see them as socio-ecological systems or ecosystems that yield services, massively complicated in the way they deliver these things. There are lots of factors relevant to decisions over wider geographical scales and involving more people, and the decisions are very political. As Cohen comments, reviewing White, the virtual river is a much nicer and less complicated place than the real one. So we need to reimagine the organic machine and understand it in all its complexity. I'll say 4 things about what we might do. The first is we do need a better understanding of the river. We need a better understanding of impacts. They're very complicated. Many of them are remote from dam sites. Many are delayed. Many are politically complicated because river basins cross borders. And you can see with the GERD just how difficult it is to retrofit operational schemes once the dam's built. And dam impacts interact, they're complex and emergent, and they're getting more complex with time as we start to drill down, for example, into the carbon take of concrete and so on. So we need a better understanding of impacts. We need new, better and linked models, and that, as I see it, is the great contribution of the modeling components of the Future Dams project. We also need, and I won't go into that because the modelers know far better than me how easily and how difficult it is to bring in a wider set of issues and make better and better linked models. But we also need to understand how models frame analysis. We need to recognize the things that are not recognized in models, things that are not fully understood or not taken into account And we need to get better at dealing with unknowns and uncertainties and transferring our uncertainty into the model output so that people don't assume that everything's covered. Climate variability, for example, if you think about rivers like those of West Africa or other regions which have had periods of wet decades and dry decades, we need to understand those, even though many of them go beyond the hydrological record. We need to understand the impacts of global heating and the fact that the hydrology rivers is likely to be non-stationary. We need to understand the demands of energy policy much better than we do. Second, we need to see dams from below. This is a quote from an interview which Chris Schultz did with one of the World Commission on Dams commissioners. He says, we were in a village where you could see the reservoir, and this village didn't have electricity or irrigation water. And one of the commissioners asked, several questions like, so you don't have any of the benefits of this project? And it was like, nope. And I think it was on a bus ride going back that he was crying quietly. And I remember speaking with him, and it was like, I've been an engineer for 50 years. I've worked on these projects, and it's breaking my heart that 20 years after this dam was built, these communities aren't getting anything. We have to learn to understand dams from below. We need to understand winners and losers better than we've done in the past. We need to think both about, we need to think particularly hard about how we deal with the needs of people who are losers from dam projects, and understand here Ted Scudder saying, I've never been able to understand the rationale behind the government's lack of concern for the welfare of citizens being forced off their land. So we need to see dams from below. We need to understand the people that they affect. We need to respond to the World Commission on Dams' challenge to turn those affected into beneficiaries. We need to really think about dam projects in terms of in whose name they're planned, by whose decisions they're built, for whose benefits they're designed and operated, and to whose detriment is the project. So we need to get much better, I think, at thinking holistically about that, rather than just assuming they'll make the economy bigger and that rising sea will float all ships, as if distribution didn't matter. And lastly, we need to get better at thinking about the machine, the river, as something that's adaptive. This is the picture I started with. It's the site of the former Fort Halifax Dam on the Sebastopol River in Maine. Constructed in 1908, removed in 2008. There it is in action. Dam removal has become an increasingly important issue in dam projects. So we need to understand that the engineering we have for a river now is not necessarily the engineering we're going to need. We need to build these structures expecting to have to adapt them and change them, change their purposes, change the way they're managed, perhaps remove them altogether where society and the economy requires it. So that's it. I think that my point is really that the more technically complex we make the planning of dams, the more excellent we make the conception of the river as a model perfect project, we need to understand that it has to go back to the real river, and we have to think about the complexity of the real river, and we have to think about the people who depend on it in ways that we are not doing, in ways that I think the World Commission pointed to, but in ways that we're not doing. And we have to get better at that. It's not a technical challenge. It's a challenge of priorities. It's a challenge of politics and democracy. I'll stop there, Tim. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill. Sorry, cranky voice. Really fascinating talk. So just, I know a few people have come in a little bit after we've started. So what we're going to do now is I've got a couple of questions that I'll pose to Bill to kick off the discussion, and we'll also have a couple of questions from our case study partners in Ghana and India that are on the call with us today, and then we will open things up for wider Q&A from the rest of the audience. Please do, if you want to, start posting some of your questions in the chat box, and we can then sort of call on you one by one once we get to the Q&A segment in 5 or 10 minutes time. I guess just to kick things off, Bill, I mean, it's a really kind of fascinating sort of trace through this of the history of dams and developments and the challenges that we faced over many decades now. This is something that I and others have thought about a little bit on the project in recent years, but you've kind of highlighted a process where in many ways we've known what a lot of the negative outcomes are of some of these developments for quite some time now. There are lots that has been written on some of the underpinning reasons for why those outcomes emerge. I guess a question would be, do you think we're learning from any of those several decades on? If not, why not? And what do we need to do better to kind of avoid these sort of continued sort of failed attempts at achieving a perfect river?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Yeah, I think people learn and forget. If you like, think of the dams community learns and forgets, partly because it turns over, and the people who learn are not necessarily the people whose learning matters in terms of new projects. I mean, the dam building world is immeasurably more complicated than it was 40 years ago when I briefly worked in it. In the sense, lots of new actors, lots of new money chasing, looking for a lodgement, lots of green investment funds and so on, and people making loan decisions who don't have much experience. So I think there's learning, but I think we're bad at synthesizing the lessons of learning. And I think in that sense, it's an opportunity was lost with the report of the World Commission, that it kind of went into the wilderness for a bit and had to be slowly brought back. So I think there's a lot of forgetting, and I think in many instances the forgetting matters more than learning. So what I think really I would say is that the big difficulty is that people look upstream at what the dam is supposed to be doing. We need a new energy source. We need to generate new energy, and this is they look around and see the dam as that process. They don't think of it holistically, and I think that's a real difficulty, and I think that has always been the case. I used to spend a lot of time in the 80s and 90s talking to civil engineers about dam projects and trying to convince them to take seriously the critiques that were being made of dams by social scientists, anthropologists, community groups, and others, and conservationists. Not to feel bad about their work, but simply to be able to include it and get it better. And actually, I thought that had worked. I thought the World Commission did a pretty good job. But that's perhaps because I'm an idealist who doesn't have to make my living building or operating dams.
I guess a follow-on question to that before we move over to Amita, who has a comment and a question, would be, you kind of highlighted the role that models have and continue to have, and I guess increasingly with thinking about design of dams under climate change. The use of models, river basin assessment tools is becoming more and more prominent, particularly over recent years. Do you think that sort of the use of computer models, given the challenges that you point out, does it help us? On the one hand, models are designed to, in part, to be able to deal with sort of exploring some of the complexity, or do you think it hinders our ability to actually deal with that complexity in the planning process? And how do you think modelers need to approach the work that they do to avoid some of the issues that you've kind of highlighted around power dynamics and politics that come into ultimately the decisions are made partially based on some of the sort of insights that those tools are used to generate?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, I think models have a fantastic amount to contribute, and it's extraordinary how fast they're advancing and getting very good. I think the thing that's really difficult for modelers, whether they're academic or sort of commercial, is, well, there's several things that are very difficult. One is passing through the assumptions, making clear what the assumptions are, and therefore what kinds of conclusions can be drawn from the model. If you can see this very clearly in climate change, where obviously the community, there has been a very strong skeptical community, and therefore the methods used and the assumptions have been pored over very carefully. There isn't such universal skepticism in areas like dam construction, but the same problems are there. So I think making clear what the assumptions are, making clear what the barriers of certainty or uncertainty are, I think are really important. Trying to stop people looking at models, looking at science for answers. Science is really good at asking questions. Modeling is really good at saying, well, if we make these assumptions, we look, how would it work? What does it look like? How do we understand this system better? But the people who want the modeling done, they want an answer. What's the optimal way of doing it? If we build a dam like this, what will the power yield be? What are the chances of catastrophic flooding? Blah blah blah. So I think trying to get through the uncertainties without, of course, doing themselves out of a job, it seems to me is a really important thing. And that's hard to do, particularly when it's so complicated, so difficult for people who are not modelers to understand what's going on, how they work. I remember Julian saying at one stage his dream was to have, a complicated, a sophisticated Basin model that could run with a simple front end on a mobile phone, so that a villager could understand how much water they were going to get, so that the protesters against dam projects, therefore, would have the same knowledge base as the River Basin Authority or the government. And therefore, you could have an informed discussion, which was informed on both sides by modeling. So maybe that's the answer at the end of the day, when we look to technological progress to make these things possible. Of course, the kind of people who are most often ignored and end up losing in dam projects don't have powerful mobile phones. They have simple mobile phones. But nonetheless, I think the challenge to democratize model outputs is a really interesting one, important one, actually.
Really, really good points, and I agree. I mean, I think there's maybe something that the dam and the water resource modeling community can potentially learn from some of the approaches that have been taken in the climate change modeling community, and how they have approached some of those sort of issues of uncertainty and transparency in uncertainty, but also in sort of equity and access to data and information across different groups. I think we'll pass it over now to Amita. I think you have a question and a comment for Bill. I don't know if you want to kind of unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I'm in Delhi, India, and I have worked for many years in the area of the Narmada Valley, where, as you know, a large dam, the Sardar Sarovar project, displaced very, very large numbers of people. So I did my early work in around 1990. And so I've been, listening to the dam conversation since then. And I'm actually surprised that in so many ways, there's a kind of cultivated naivety that still persists, which is that, well, we're trying our best. We are trying to improve our technical standards in terms of modeling or whatever, but we can't help it if things go wrong. And that naivety really does come from a place of power and privilege, because it means that you can say, oops, we didn't get it right this time. We can do it better next time, because you're not accountable. And to talk about the politics of modeling, that conversation must happen within the context of the wider politics of the money that's behind dams. And the reason why governments love them, because contractors give kickbacks, all the rest of it. So I think there's a kind of misrecognition of the politics of dams, and that misrecognition is deliberate, because at the end of the day, the Platonic ideal of the good dam doesn't exist, because all dams anywhere operate in a political and, a political economy, a political ecology. So that was my comment. The question that I have for you is, what do you see, given, I think there are three new developments which are really interesting, which might actually change this, the rate of dam building. One of them, I think, is, as you also said, that ecological uncertainty has increased with climate change. So whether the river happens to be fed by snowmelt or by rainfall, I mean, we know on the Indian subcontinent, flows are even harder to predict than they were before. And even if you have better mapping techniques, you still don't have a clue about what's going to happen. So one, what are dam builders thinking about that? Second, the cost of solar has come down hugely. So I would assume that the financial viability of dams is now going to be different. And already in northeastern India, we know that a lot of projects for which there were MOUs signed aren't actually getting built because people don't want, to actually make good that investment. And actually building dams, because it ties up your money for it ties up a lot of money for a long time, because it takes time to build a dam. It's not as nimble a way of dealing with what is, a hugely rapidly changing field, which is the energy sector, especially around renewables. So dams are actually dinosaurs. They can't turn around fast enough. Whereas with solar, the costs are plummeting. So I'd like to just hear your views about how you think that affects dam building. And third is the question of the way in which, from an entirely different direction, we have a recognition of a wider recognition of what a lot of communities have always believed, that rivers are sacred and that rivers need to have rights, as that's now being legally recognized in New Zealand and elsewhere, and elsewhere, that rivers are living entities and perhaps they need to have legal rights. Very hard to operationalize, but the principle that you can re-engineer sacredness into law is I think really an interesting one. And just as a symbolism of the Hoover Dam matters as much as its actual effects. Perhaps the symbolism of thinking about a river as a goddess may also have influence in this particular set of debates around dams, which just seem to go round and round sometimes. Thank you.
Mm. Thank you, Amita. That's a super comment and set of questions. And I don't have good answers to them, but I think you're really putting your finger on important things. I mean, climate change is really important. I have seen engineering projects that do not take account of past rainfall fluctuations. So somewhere, for example, in a place I used to work in the dry part of, Sahel of West Africa, in northern Nigeria, if you look back over the 50 years of rainfall records, you have in 1980 you have a certain amount, but you have drought periods, you have dry centuries, you have dry millennia. So if you think on a 1,000-year time scale, you've got a real problem. So climate change, in the way that it's shifting patterns of rainfall in particular, I think is going to be profoundly problematic. And I think it is a really interesting question for hydrological modeling, is how to take account of the uncertainties, how to link to climate models and so on. It's getting a lot more difficult. And I think there are going to be real questions for the future. One of them is how you take dams out. And I don't mean little dams in France or the US, which you can do with a cleverly situated bulldozer and a bit of a budget. I mean, fancy taking out the Tabela Dam in Pakistan. I mean, it's huge. Because when it was planned with a sort of 30-year, because of the discount rate, the economics was assumed it had a 30-year life. No one said, and then what's the cost of dealing with that? But even so, it would have been a small cost because it's more than 30 years in the future, so you forget about it. But it becomes a real cost. And it will be interesting to see over the next, 50 to 100 years, some of the great dams of the 20th century, coming to the end of their safe life, the costs of taking them down. So that there's real questions around climate change. I think the other thing that climate change does is it puts everyone into a panic. And we've just had in the UK this sort of the Glasgow summit, and everybody is talking about brinkmanship and existential crisis and the need to have huge actions right now. And of course, the difficult actions are the ones that affect lifestyles. So decarbonizing, the average household is painful politics, whereas actions that increase the amount of hydro by building dams upset far fewer people. So I fear that one of the effects of climate change will be that there will be a rush to lodge money in long-term, apparently sustainable projects, and therefore there will be a surge in hydropower production, hydropower dam building over the next couple of decades. And I think much of that will play to the worst part of our playbook, because I think those dams will be basically, they'll be rushed. And if you rush it, then you don't take proper account of all of the possible problems and impacts, and those will be problematic dams. And I think rushing is always everything's always rushed, and in the case of dams, it just doesn't work. So climate change is really interesting. I think it's something huge for the future. Dams as dinosaurs, yes, I suspect, there's a lot of people talking about the new roles for dams, for example, providing short-term storage when there isn't any wind blowing, or when you get a dark day or whatever. And they're very different sorts of dams, and they have to be in different sorts of places, and they have their own problems. You suddenly have rivers with massive flows of water down them. If you ever walk in the Alps, where many of the rivers have been captured for hydropower generation, it's the one thing that's jumped into you is do never camp in a river valley. Never, be aware that at any moment a large flush of water can come down. And ecologically, they're really weird, disastrous really, because there's no water in them, and then there's a huge flow, and then there's no water again. So that's pretty tricky if you're into fish populations or whatever. So dams as dinosaurs, yes, I suppose, right, because it's not that if we have them, they're perhaps the wrong shape and the wrong place, and not particularly responsive. We maybe need dams, but not the ones we've got. Rivers are sacred, and rivers right. Yes, I'm conscious by talking about picking up the river machine. It's a very mechanistic way of thinking, although that's not quite what Richard White meant in his book. He's trying to sort of make us understand that human actions and natural actions interact in complex ways, and there's a real responsibility there. Yes, I think the notion of rivers as having rights, I think the notion of valuing rivers as providers of complex ecosystem services, which is another sort of reductionist language, but it does help. It does make one think more broadly about them, not just as providing big bucks in terms of hydropower or irrigation water, but also the other things that they provide. And also the things they provide to poor people, which are not as valuable as the things they provide to rich people, unfortunately, because of the way the economics works. I think that's really important. So yeah, thinking about rivers differently, I think it's in a sense is a key part of what I've been trying to think about, how you can recognize the need or the desirability from a human perspective of drawing benefits from rivers, and what fantastic benefits one can draw, but they're much broader than we've often thought. And therefore we need to understand that we're, as Richard White said, we're part of this machine. It's not our machine, that we're standing outside it, kind of moving the cogs to make the machine work faster. We are part of it, and we are it and it is us. That's not quite spiritual, but it's certainly awkward by the standards of the 20th century as a way of thinking. Helpfully awkward, I think. So yeah, great questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Amita and Bill for the responses. We've got a few questions and comments in the chat. So the first of those from Eduardo kind of links into the point that Amita was making at the end of her comment. So sort of, what are the other ways of building our relationships with the organic machine that don't involve building things, and whatever this concept of granting personhood or rights to rivers can be part of the solution. Eduardo, I don't know whether you want to add anything to that based on the discussion that we've just had, if you're still with us. Eduardo, are you? I can see you here. I think, Bill, I don't know whether you have any kind of additional sort of reflections on that question.
No, I was slightly distracted reading some of the comments. There's some really interesting comments coming up in the, as always, in the chat. It's as if you know, there's a whole set of conversations going on, but some really interesting things coming up there. I love Jamie Skinner's comment in there. Engineers don't like managing uncertainty, and maybe that's he's put his finger on what I was trying to say, which is the fact that we therefore create a perfect river in our heads, or indeed in our computers, which doesn't have that or that uncertainty is actually reduced down into something that's predictable and modelable. But actually, the real rivers are really uncertain, and the future is very uncertain. So maybe that's our problem. We need to get better at managing uncertainty.
Jamie, do you have anything to add to that from Bill's reflection on your comment?
No, that's fine. I was actually agreeing with him at the time as well. I mean, I think that one of the other points that I was trying to make was the sort of negative consequences of having a plan. So somebody writes a 500-page plan and justifies and defends it, and I think firmly believes that everything they've written in that plan will come to pass. And that is just the same whether it's the amount of concrete that's going to be poured and the electricity that's generated, which is sort of probably 98% reliable, as it is in the resettlement plan, which is probably 23% reliable. Simply because we don't control the way local people are going to respond and what their opportunities and the markets and the yields of their crops and their grazing lands are going to look like, in the same way that we control how much concrete you pour. And I firmly believe in the projects I've been involved in that the engineers don't want to impoverish communities, and they're always slightly surprised when my magnificent plan somehow didn't turn out exactly as I'd written it. And I think that is the point that I was trying to make, is that the way in which that planning process was done and the belief that those writers have in the plan is one dimension of why it goes wrong. And it's this, and the general point being the uncertainty point. It's a plan. It doesn't deal with uncertainty. It's a plan that says this is what's going to happen.
That's really interesting, and I was going to put a piece in one day, but I cut it out, which was thinking about the differences between it's by a paper by Brian Wynne, written back in the 1990s, on a famous paper about Chernobyl. The Chernobyl fallout in the Lake District, which was expected. You know, Chernobyl power station went up, and the radioactive material went up over Scandinavia and down over the UK, and it was expected not to linger in the uplands of Britain, and it did. And he's trying to explore sort of why it did. And he talks about the difference between risk, which is, he says that risk assessments are something that were developed to deal with high technology manufactured systems like aerospace, and where you can test everything, and where you, and secondly, sort of uncertainty, where you don't actually know how things are going to operate, but you can guess, you can make models, you can estimate how they're going to work. And indeterminacy, he says indeterminacy is the problem, because uncertainty is dealt with by more science and more modeling, but indeterminacy is about things like how will people respond. And in this case, the problem was that they thought that the work that had been done on radioactivity in soils worked for clay soils, but these were acid upland soils, and therefore the stuff didn't disappear. It was still there, and for years you had radioactive sheep in the Lake District that nobody could eat. And he said the problem was therefore that we didn't know that we hadn't done it right, that we thought, okay, soil works like this, but oh, there are different kinds of soils. Oh, and it works differently. So that piece of knowledge, we didn't know that we didn't know it. And that's the sort of thing that's really problematic, I think, with the attempt to create a perfect plan, which is what Jamie's just been talking about. The problem is that you don't know how it's going to be implemented. You don't probably know enough about who's there anyway. So resettlement is a good example, and downstream ecological effects are others, where we're continually surprised, and we shouldn't be surprised that we're surprised. It's, you know, we don't have a system that's that good. And that's not a criticism of modelers, because they do fantastic things, but there's always something they don't know. There's always something scientists don't know. That's what science is about. If they knew everything, they could pack up and go home. And so it's a case for more and better models, but it's also a case for greater skepticism in the way we let the knowledge we have be used. And there's a nice question by Dale Whittington talking about who would you ask? Where would dam builders today go to see and talk to someone who's has it right for dams? And somebody's suggested Europe. Well, I don't know. I certainly think you need to go and look at dam projects. And that, of course, sorry to sound like a crack record, that was a great thing that the World Commission on Dams did. It actually did a huge amount of work to try and understand the history of dam projects and how what had happened from them. We don't do that very much. We don't do that anything like enough. None of the people, I suspect, who are signing off on new dams will ever have seen a dam project, will never have, canoed down a river and talked to people after a dam project's been built or gone to a resettlement site. We just don't allow ourselves to know what happens. And if you do that, of course, you make silly plans.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of maybe that's to sort of add to Dale's point about where do we go to look for the examples of stuff where people are perhaps getting some of these lessons right. There perhaps needed to be also more of a focus on people going back and looking at where we get things wrong and why, and using that to perhaps inform some of the understanding of the blind spots in where we perhaps don't know what the uncertainties are, or certainly don't know anywhere near enough to bound what those uncertainties are in the traditional way that a quantitative modeler would approach that kind of problem. I think that maybe links to sort of Amita's comment about the fact that there's also a need to kind of institutionalize some of this in the way that we're training people that are engaging in dam building and design and development. I mean, yes, I always find that interesting as someone who's not an engineer, who sits in an engineering department, how little some of our students necessarily appreciate some of the complexity of implementation of infrastructure projects beyond the technical design aspects. We've got, I'm just working my way through the comments and questions that are popping up in the chat. We've got a question from Vincent. I don't know if you're with us, Vincent, and you want to ask your question.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. So thanks so much, Adams, for your very wonderful presentation. I'm currently in Ghana, and I'm having a PhD research on the cross-generational longer-term impact of the Volta Dam. In the case of the Volta Dam, about, like you said, 80,000 people who were displaced were resettled into 52 communities. And these communities were spread across 4 of the then 10 administrative regions. And it's interesting what actually my preliminary findings in terms of the cross-generational longer-term impact, even though it's been over 5 decades since the building of the Kosombo Dam, the Volta Dam, and its related resettlement. But the impact, some of the impact is very much alive today. Just last week, I was in some of the communities that were displaced to listen to the people, those that are alive, their descendants, and some of the stories were quite sad to hear. So, for instance, ask you, just to hear about your thoughts. Who do you think are really, really responsible in this dam conversation? Who are responsible for, or how do we actually ensure a balance between the positive imagination of dam building as well as its related uncertainties, both in the short, middle, and longer term? Yeah.
Thank you, Vincent. Thanks for your comment. And that research sounds really, really interesting. I mean, I mentioned Ted Scudder, and his work on the Kariba also showed those kind of long-term multi-generational impacts. I think that's really important to say that. Who has responsibility to do it? I think this kind of research is really important. And I think it's unfortunate that it so often has to be done by it's done by lone scholars, by PhD students. It's done by disciplines that are a long way from the heart of dam planning, and which is driven by sort of hydrology, engineering, particularly economics. So it's really important to do it. And I think there's a real responsibility to share the results of it. So I think there's a real role for sort of social science research and others. I think there's a real role for trying to allow people who have experienced these things a voice, particularly perhaps something we've not done much in the past is sort of through the arts and so on, to make it part of the conversation. Because, I mean, to pick up Jamie Skinner's comment, I mean, people, engineers in particular, designing projects absolutely do not want to have unplanned negative impacts. How are they to learn what to avoid? How are they to learn the difficulties and the challenges? And how are they to engineer, if you like, in their terms, a project which doesn't do those things? They have to discover it. So on the one hand, we have to make those voices heard through research, and good luck with your research on that front. I think there's also a responsibility for those on the technical side to not dismiss, to listen. And I think it's a hard listen, because so many of those who are anti-dam, or those who write about dams critically, are seen as anti-dam, and they're very strident. And it's easy to be strident if you're angry about something on someone else's behalf. But to get through that and start to understand it and translate these problems into the terms in which the planning is done. So I think there's a role for both technical disciplines and others, and a conversation which has to be national and international. Within Ghana, for example, the conversation about the benefits that, say, new dam projects could bring versus the harm that they could bring, and an honest, straightforward discussion. And yeah, that's, I mean, it's not an easy thing to bring about, which is why I think it hasn't happened. It is what the World Commission tried to do. It put into one room 12 people, some of whom came from the anti-dam community, and some came from the donor and the pro-dam community. And what the work that Chris Schultz has done, has led on the project I've been involved in with him, he's sort of concluded that within the room it worked. The people came to a common position. They couldn't bring their communities with them. So the anti-dam people didn't like it because it wasn't fierce enough, and the pro-dam people didn't like it because they thought it was too fierce. So it's not an easy conversation to have, but it is a conversation that's got to happen, so that and it's something I think that's got to happen because the planning is so much at national scale. It's got to happen within countries. It's no good just having it sort of, as it were, on the streets of Glasgow. It's got to be national, and in places where it's not necessarily easy to have that kind of conversation. Not all countries are places where you can subject government decision-making to critique with impunity. We live in a world where these things are not easy. So yeah, I think it just has to be a bigger, more honest conversation than it has often been in the past. Which in a way I was trying to offer this sort of notion of, well, how does this machine work? And, as a way of getting people to talk about it. It's a sort of metaphor, if you like, that historian's metaphor could be useful in the future.
We have a few minutes left. There's still a number of questions and comments in the chat. I guess in the interest of time, we've got we've got a couple of comments from William and Samuel highlighting some of the areas where there's evidence related to big dam experiences with outcomes-based resettlement processes that link in and perhaps sort of provide useful inputs to some of the challenges that we've talked about, and also some of the aspects around the International Hydropower Association and the role that they could potentially play in terms of knowledge sharing on some of these topics. In the time that we've got left, I'll just take the next question that we have in the chat box. So Amali, would you like to pose your question for Bill?
Yeah, thank you, Tim, and thank you, Bill. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. You can see I have a sort of a framing problem with the question there, and so the first response Europe was when I started typing the question out, and yeah, so that wasn't a response. But you could clearly see that almost across Europe, a lot of dams are being pulled down, and it doesn't hurt them to get a few penny to build another dam in a developing country, of course. Taking up contracts, and also the same promises are being meted out disproportionately, or I wouldn't say research are not done on it, but it's very hard, or it's been very hard to minimize these negative consequences of dams. I have also worked on the Baccalaureate Dam, which you highlighted from the talk in Nigeria, also together then with Professor Adeneji. And of course, it's a disappointment, but this is not the first of them, and this is not the last. And as we're speaking, there are a lot of dams that are also still being built in Africa. And so, like, moving up forward from here, it's obvious that with climate discussions, more dams are going to be built. And how do you think we could actually overcome this politics of interest in what I call it, and without neglecting the livelihoods that actually depend on them or the services that dams provide? And secondly, you also highlighted that the lifespan of a dam, of course, is dictated by the services that it provides, irrigation schemes, for example, or hydropower. And taking off these dams would mean having to cut off these services. And so before pulling off the rug, a sort of transition scheme or transition model that would make the community a little bit more resilient if these services are provided by the dams are to be taken out by, let's say, destroying the dam or getting rid of it as the case may be. And so without having to create another problem, likewise. So I don't know if I'm able to convey the question, but just wrapping my thoughts around it. Thank you.
Thank you, Amali. That's a really interesting set of points. And I mean, your point about the way in which Europeans are sort of destroying dams at the same time, it's expertise and bank and money that from Europe and other places that is funding new dams elsewhere. That's of course that's the difficult underbelly of shifts towards sustainability and the uniquely difficult position that wealthy countries with a long and exploitative colonial past face at the present time in doing anything sensible. So I think you're right. I mean, essentially, I think what I sense from your comment that you're interested in how we strike a balance between the benefits that dams can bring and the costs that they can bring. I think that's exactly the question. That's exactly the difficult thing. And it's very difficult because the pressure, the enthusiasm, the inertia towards dam construction is very strong, often in particular cases, but also more generally, they're seen generically. And there is this notion, well, we didn't quite get that right, but the next one will be fine. And that's why I think Ted Scudder's testimony is so important, because he went on doing that through his career. I came across him in the early 1980s when he was writing about planned releases. Let's design dams which are designed to promote floodplain agriculture, to make dam and sort of links together the upstream in the reservoir and the downstream in the valley, and sort of use the dam to create wealth from source to sea. And he went on believing that those sort of projects could be developed, and he did involvement in all sorts of World Bank and other commissions to try and work on projects to make them like that. And now, I guess, in advanced age, he's he's depressed about the feasibility of doing it. I think he's wrong. It has to be done. The search for a good dam has to go on. They have to get better, not worse. And I think the real challenge for the 2020s is to make sure that we build dams that are as good as we've ever built that have ever been built in the past, not as bad or worse. My fear is that they're as bad or worse. For all the reasons that they were bad in the 1980s and 1990s, they're not thought through thoroughly enough. People are not thinking hard enough about those who are affected. They're not listening, they're not taking the time. And I regret to say that I think sort of the power of modeling actually just strengthens their hand, and it shouldn't. They should treat the models as a way of understanding the things they can't immediately see, and they should make us more cautious, more careful. But maybe that's just what you'd expect someone of my age and stage to be saying.
I think we're now at the time, or a little over the time that we've got for the seminar today. So I think we will have to wrap things up at that point. I know we've still got a few questions and comments to get through. There will be a recording of the webinar made available on the Future Dams website. And obviously, please, if you have a question that we haven't been able to get to for Bill, do reach out and get in touch with him after the webinar is finished. So just a final thank you to Bill again for a really fascinating presentation and discussion. As I mentioned earlier, this is our final webinar of 2021, and we will have a few more when we reconvene in the new year as part of the final stages of the Future Dams project. So do stay tuned and look out for details of those in the coming weeks. Thank you everyone once again for attending, and hope to see all of you again in the new year.